Okay. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Also, good evening there in the US. Welcome to our fourth week, the last lecture of fourth week of our Balongibog Talks COVID-19 segment. It's this segment is sponsored and organized by the Partido State University through the Center for Partido Studies, directed by Dr. Danilo Hirona. Um, the Partido Institute of Economics, directed by Roland John Bulao, the Museo de Isarog, the College of Arts and Sciences, headed by Dean Erlene de Basilia, the Office of the University President, by Dr. Raul G. Bradesina, the Office of the Board Secretary, Ms. Leanne O'Donnell, who's also with us in this panel. The PASPECUF, Museum Student Volunteers, and Ateneo Dinaga Social Sciences Department chaired by Mary Joyce Bulao. So I'm Earl Hernandez. I'm the Museo de Isarog curator, and I'll be the moderator for this morning. This week we talked. We had two lectures, and this is our third lecture for this week. But it's our 17th lecture for our entire series. So the first two lectures talked on history, we talked on the past, and we talked on the science and technology. It's an interesting to end this week by having it linking the past and the present through video game archaeology with Mikhail Garcia Echavarri. He's a soon-to-be doctor from the University of Washington. Kale has been doing his fieldwork in Philippines in Ifugao, and for the past few years, he's been working in Bicol archaeology. He's also doing his dissertation topic on Bicol. So we're so honored to have Kale with us this morning. So Kale?
Hi, I'm gonna try and share my screen now. Let's see. Can everyone see it?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
All right, cool. Well, thank you, Earl, for inviting me to give a talk. And thank you to Partido State and everyone involved for organizing this. I think it's really cool. And I'm excited to sort of give my perspective on some things. When Earl first asked me to give a talk on a topic related to COVID-19 and his topic on the new normal, I didn't really know what to talk about. But then I realized I've been thinking about video game archaeology a lot more because I must confess to that. Being under lockdown for the past 60 days, I've been playing more video games than normal. So let's jump into this. I have a silly little graphic to begin. Okay. So this talk comes out of a combination of a couple things. Some of my research interests revolve around video game archaeology. It's kind of been a side project to the important research that I'm doing with Dr. Akabato and Earl and everyone else in the Philippines. And also just the fact that we're under lockdown, and that poses some challenges to traditional archaeology. So those challenges revolve around networking with people and also travel. We can't travel by plane, and we often can't travel to the sites we're interested in going to anymore, at least at the moment. And also, to do ethical archaeological research, you need to be interacting with people and not just be alone, digging a hole in some random field. And social distancing poses those challenges. So a couple ways to deal with being sort of stuck in your home or stuck isolated. Archaeologically, our first thing would be to think about getting to what we call gray literature, which are archaeological reports written by archaeologists that are sort of contained in repositories or in museums, and they aren't published for the public to see. They haven't been digested by archaeologists and then reproduced for everyone to read. And we've been developing sort of a backlog of this over time. It's kind of a thing that a lot of people are thinking through. Another way we can deal with this is to start thinking about how archaeology can deal with contemporary issues. How are we dealing with material culture in our modern day? And especially as now we're moving towards this sort of half digital, half real life world that we're living in. The emerging video game archaeology subdiscipline may have a little bit to teach us about doing this. So in this talk, I'm going to sort of talk about video games a little bit and how people are playing video games now under quarantine. Then I'll define video games from a video game archaeologist perspective. Then we'll jump into what actually is video game archaeology, and then finally answer a little bit of the why I'm pushing to do more video game archaeology, especially now. And throughout I'll give some examples of what we're talking about. So let's jump in. If you just Google coronavirus and video games, you're going to get a lot of headlines about more and more people playing for more and more amount of time, and about how people are spending their social time now, instead of outside or at the bar or at the movies, they're doing it within game spaces. Also, it's a way, people are saying it's a way to escape from your lockdown situation, or just to spend time doing something else outside of your daily life. And this has always been true, but it's become more acutely true now. So with that in mind, just thinking about the fact that there's just more and more people exploiting video game spaces more and more, how can anthropology and archaeology start to kind of dig into this a little bit? So what is a video game from our perspective, at least? I tend to think of them from sort of 3 levels of definition. And that is, 1, they're an interactive medium that video games can generate or be digital spaces. And then finally, that they are empathy engines. So I'll get into each of these. So the first one, interactive media. Video game is a shorthand for an interactive digital medium. This is not like a movie that you're watching or a book that you're reading. Instead, you're inputting commands through like a keyboard or your touchscreen on your phone or mouse or a controller, and the game takes that input, interprets it, runs it through its system, and then puts out a new output that you internalize, interpret, and then put in a new command in response, and that happens back and forth multiple times a minute and throughout the game session. The mechanics, dynamics, aesthetics framework is a way of thinking about this from a designer's perspective, that the game has been created with rules and a system, and that players and users are working with those rules to manipulate the system, and have basically the end goal of a game is to have fun or to have an experience. One way to kind of think about this, if you don't really play all that many games, is think of a card game like Partido or poker, and you have a set of rules that you've been told, and if you haven't played it before, you're grappling with these rules and you're not really having fun until you've mastered the systems a little bit of the card game, and up until that point, your grandma's been beating you. So that's the first level here. Video games are an interactive medium rather than a passive medium. The second is pretty simple. It's just that video games are or can generate virtual spaces. This is an image from Assassin's Creed Origins set in Ptolemaic Egypt. And the player can go and, using their player avatar, the woman here in the corner, visit the pyramids or visit the cities that are in the distance there. This is a whole 3D virtual environment to explore. And most games have what we call spaces. So that can be anything to this semi-photorealistic world here to something more, blocked in, or top down, like a map type of thing when you're moving your character around from the top point of the view, or even just descriptive. Some text-based games, for instance, will just describe a setting to you, and then you input where you want to move, and it re-describes where you are. So video games as virtual spaces. And then this one is a little bit more meta. It's video games are empathy engines. And so what I mean by that is that they have the capacity to generate empathy at a different level than other media. And this is by virtue of their interactivity. And this comes out of Elizabeth Sampat's pretty good book called Empathy Engines, where she argues that video games should be thought of as an engine to generate empathy rather than just a game. And that the uncritical use or development of these engines can lead to problems since you're not in full control of what you're asking players to empathize with. So she gives her main example here is before this quote, she describes a sad point in her childhood and suggests that if she had made a game about that sad point, that instead of telling you about it, that by placing you in the circumstance, instead of describing her own feelings, you'll generate or have feelings of your own. And at the end, you won't feel sympathy, you'll feel empathy. And because you've had a small taste of what it's really like. And so she argues that that's the immersive power of game systems in action. So kind of another way to think about this is that our world that we're living in real life is a giant complex system, and that video games, each in their own way, are a microsystem that is asking you to understand some part of our larger system. And that designers who explicitly deal with that are then are fully in control of what exactly they want you to empathize with, rather than something that's a little bit less critical and you're playing through something that may be having conflicting things, or maybe asking you to engage in a topic that is uncomfortable, for instance. So empathy engines. So to put that all together, video games are, from our perspective, systems in which players use input devices to interact with the game's rules and systems, often in digital spaces. And then these players come away with thoughts, feelings, and conclusions about their experience, and this becomes a cycle. So that's a video game from our perspective and for our uses here. So what exactly then is video game archaeology? I boil it down to three sort of sub-definitions that kind of build on each other a little bit. Other people like Dr. Andrew Reinhard, who I have a citation later for, he has, I think, 5, but I think they really boil down to this. Is one, you can think of the video game archaeology as the study of games as artifacts. So this is very much akin to being a ceramicist or being a zoo archaeologist. You're studying the actual video games as artifacts, and in order to analyze them, you need to play through them. And that's your expertise, is being able to play through a game, understand its systems, and how players may be entangled within those systems. This is, like understanding the components or the elemental structure of pottery and the designs, aesthetics, and where they're coming from. So it's very similar to that. At a different level, we can also think of video game archaeology as the study of archaeology portrayed in games. This is a bit of your traditional media's approach, but it becomes a little bit more high stakes when you think about games then as empathy engines, rather than rather than watching something like Indiana Jones and all the trouble that he gets into, like looting and all of that. The player may be asked to be Indiana Jones and to loot of their own accord, and that in some ways is a little bit more dangerous. So those two levels, and then this third level gets a little bit more meta. So, oh right, sorry. I thought this would be a fun little view of what archaeological portrayal in a game can be. This is set in Horizon Zero Dawn. It's a video game that came out in 2017, and you're playing in a very post-apocalyptic world where our culture has died off, and people are trying to understand what we went through. And the player is interacting with their version of an archaeologist who's very interested in mugs. And hopefully, if you're an archaeologist, you'll get a kick out of this.
Yes, I remember you. Did you find the vessels I seek?
What sort of ritual were these vessels made for?
I'm convinced they were used in conjunction with each other in sets. Some people believe they were used for tea ceremonies. Others think they held sacred essences and oils for worship. But I believe they were used for the solemn custom of shaving one's beard. One for water, one for lotion, and so on. Each fluid in its special vessel, majestically applied to the face at each stage of the rite. It must have been breathtaking. But which vessel was used for which? I have to know. I have to continue my research.
Are you sure people didn't just drink out of them?
Drink? Out of such finely crafted earthenware? Don't be ridiculous.
So that is the portrayal of archaeology in a video game. In some ways, it shows the developers show a real understanding of what a way to parody archaeology, but also you're still, digging up at this point our culture and selling it to this guy. So there's a value attributed to that. But then we get to the application of archaeological study within virtual spaces or within video games, and this is where it gets a little bit more complicated. And the easiest way to introduce this, I think, is through Minecraft, which is a game that came out in 2011, where players can manipulate almost anything in the world and game space and build structures of their own. So we call this a persistent world, and persistent worlds have gotten more and more important in video games, and because of them, actually being able to do archaeology within these spaces is become more feasible. So a persistent world is a game world that stays even after you've logged off and turned off your computer. So for instance, in Minecraft, the world of the Minecraft world is on a server somewhere else. And when you log off, the world continues going about its thing without you there. It's much like your life. And it also keeps track of all the things you do. So you can build your house and your house stays built. You can, tear down a mountain or build a mine, and that all stays there. And so hopefully you can see how this digital space can be seen as an archaeological site. So in Minecraft, you would go and see how have people built their structures, how are they engaging in this generated world. So yes, players interact with persistent virtual spaces, and then as archaeologists, we can begin to recognize patterns of interaction based on the digital materials that players generate and leave behind. And like I said, this is becoming more and more of a thing because games are more and more persistent and they're keeping track of more things. This is an image from Death Stranding, a game that was released last year, in which you play as a man who carries a bunch of things around back and forth across the landscape, and he builds bridges and you can put down signs for other players to see. So very quickly, you can see that all of the icons here on the map are from other players, not the player who's playing the game. And just as a really quick analysis, you can see that along routes, the green lines here, these are the routes that the player character takes fairly often. The thicker the line, the more used this player is doing. you can see that a lot of these buildings and icons and messages that players are leaving for this particular person are being left along heavily used routes. So that's sort of the things you can start to see is how are players interacting, how are they building community here. And this gets even more complicated as we get into something like No Man's Sky. And this is a game that was released in 2016. This is an image from its galactic map. The game has a set of rules in which it generates planets and galaxies within a universe. And it's called procedural generation. It's sort of a random way of generating these planets. And actually, as you can see on this map, every dot here is a star system, and every star system has 3 or 4 planets orbiting each star. And you as the player, given time, could visit every single one of these if you wanted to. No one has the time. But if you zoom into your specific star system, each one of these planets is randomly generated to have a set of resources, its own topology, its own flora and fauna, and all of that. And then on top of that, when you get down into the world, onto that planet, different players who have been there before you may have built their own structures. So here is an image I took on this planet. I found someone else's home. They started to build a wooden structure down here by this hole that they excavated, and then decided that they wanted to build a larger habitat to be maybe mining more resources on this planet. So they built this larger habitat, and then you can see they put in ways to generate energy, battery system for their habitat, and then abandoned it. They hadn't been, by the time I reached this place to take the screenshot, they hadn't been on this planet for who knows how long. But the evidence of their spending time here and putting effort into this little pocket of their universe is there. And this extends out even larger. This is No Man's Sky itself is the site of the first really large archaeological survey of a video game, again by Dr. Andrew Reinhard, who did a massive survey of No Man's Sky, what is called a galactic hub world. So here in this image, you can see just the one little habitat from one player in some isolated planet. But players quickly figured out that they could join together and build really large galactic trading empires and hubs. And so he mapped those out and mapped out, where they were collecting their resources and started to suss out how they were interacting with each other. They were generating their own rules on top of the game rules. And in some way that is developing a subculture within the game. So I think that's neat. Basically, so now we know what is video game archaeology and that we're doing it on these video games in these virtual spaces that are even becoming more and more persistent. So why do video game archaeology? A few reasons. One, we have this accumulation rate now of video games, especially those that are persistent. Just in this talk alone, I've talked about a game called Death Stranding, a game called No Man's Sky, Minecraft, and this image here is from Animal Crossing New Horizons. These are all places, these are all games that have spaces for people to interact with, and in those spaces, people are generating their own rule sets about how they're supposed to be interacting. Also, we're pretty good at dealing with incomplete data sets. None of the sites we've ever excavated have been 100% there. There is, that's just not the way we do things or the way that the world works. And it's the same thing in video games. You never see 100% of what players have done in a game. You only see what happens if you go there and you see a snapshot in time, or if the players are done playing the game forever, you're seeing the end state. And so, like I said, you're generating subculture after subculture, and these are sort of accumulating up into a larger gaming subculture within our society. And as more and more people are interacting there and playing more games, we're seeing the impact of this gaming culture sort of reciprocate back on larger society. And the things that they empathize with in those games and the things they learn from the games that they're playing, they're applying those ideologies to the world. And I want to make a special mention about social spaces. So in this image, this is my wife playing Animal Crossing, and she's hanging out with her sister while they're both in lockdown in different states. But social spaces aren't a new thing in video games. This is Second Life from 2003, where people have their avatar and they just hang out in this weird online utopia. It's kind of faded from use nowadays, but as many people with kids might know, there's a game called Fortnite, where it started off as a game that is a competitive game where 100 people jump into a map and kill each other to see who the last one standing is. And they do this in a variety of different ways. But more and more, we're seeing middle schoolers, people in high school who are playing this game, not just to win, but actually just to hang out. It's almost akin to hanging out on a basketball court after school and having that time to decompress about school. And you're just using the mechanics of basketball to hang out and talk. And it's the same thing in the game. They're just playing the game just to have a space to talk. It's become a social space, and we're seeing more and more use of games, these types of things. So yeah, it's a new way of interacting, and I argue then that as people are spending more of their time online and they're generating a material culture that is digital and possibly ephemeral, that it warrants archaeological investigation into it. And I'm certainly going to continue doing so, and I hope that the discipline at large takes this up a little bit more. Hopefully I didn't go too fast. I got nervous, but I think that's it. Yeah. Yep. Do I stop sharing?
Okay. Are there any questions or wait? Let's stop share screen. Okay. Cool. Okay. Gallery view. Okay. Thank you, Kale, for that very insightful lecture. So it's my first time to actually hear about video game archaeology when you introduced the topic. So it was my first time to hear about it. So now, okay, we can entertain questions as long as Kale wants to answer your questions. Okay, so okay, for some of our participants both in Zoom and Facebook, you can just type your questions and then I can read your questions. For our panelists, you may want to direct your questions to Kale. It's okay. So there's a question from Dr. Peterson. So fascinating. How expensive are these games?
They really range in cost. Just from most of the games on this list are in the $40 to $60 range, but many of them have come down. They come down in price rather quickly. For instance, Assassin's Creed Origins, which was originally $60. I recently bought, because I'm TAing a class on Egypt, I bought it for $15. And that game specifically actually has a tour mode. So if you happen to be able to play that game, you can actually load into the game, start the tour mode, and it will walk you through Egypt in this time period and give you like sort of kind of a museum-like experience where it pops up images about the past and you can walk around in that virtual space. So that's pretty cool. Some games are free, so the price range is really wide.
Okay, I
I
think
have
sure.
I have three questions, Gail. One is more application for our profession. So we know that this is technology that we can use, and the scanning technology of the, what is that, PS3 or Xbox? I can't remember, but they
Xbox has
developed,
a,
yeah,
yeah, they both do
yeah.
kind of.
And so what do you think are the other technology, gaming technology that we can use in terms of our research, design, development?
Um, yeah, that's a hard question, I think, because it's hard for games are so specifically built for entertainment that a lot of their coding is kind of a black box in some ways. However, we have seen the use of, like you mentioned, the Xbox camera-mounted thing. It has lasers to scan, and that's a pretty fairly inexpensive way to scan in artifacts. I see it more, like I mentioned, AC Origins. I see it more of as a way for developing our public outreach a little bit. You can start scanning in sites and having people explore those, but you can also, in some ways, scan in a site if you know, it might take a little bit of effort, and build out what you might imagine the site look like before, you know, at the time that you're interested in, and then
I think
use that
that's,
as
yeah.
a visual scape.
Yeah, that's well, it's are we going to help them or are they going to help us? But it's a great tool for us, this gaming engines as venues for simulation, and also to as an outreach that to say that archaeology is not just the study of the past, it's the study of our present and the future, as you said earlier. The archaeology is not, it's something that we can use to understand our present society and what will happen in the future. So we can use a lot of these engines. What's that? Blender or Unity.
Unity, yeah,
To,
I've been experimenting with Unity recently, actually.
but I guess my question now, following question is, what do you think will be a good game based on your experiences in the Philippines and Philippine archaeology? What will be a good backdrop to develop a game based on on Philippine history that can also be an educational tool, not just for, you know, for entertainment, but something that uh, the Department of Education or our educators can use to for our use for our kids to learn about history and heritage.
There's a couple answers there, and I should have came prepared with their titles. I'll give them to Earl later. Maybe you can post them. There's actually a couple Filipino-based games that are being developed on the scale of an indie. So these are small studios, and they interact with different aspects of Filipino culture, sort of mythology or ways of living in pre-Hispanic periods or during the colonial period. So those are cool. I mentioned Assassin's Creed, which is a game. It's a game series that's set in different parts of the world in the past, and they usually do a very good job of portraying the specific history of those places. And I think it would be really cool to see an Assassin's Creed really take on Philippines at the time of conquest. It's sort of almost ripe for that game to portray, and if done right, you can really get people to empathize with that time period. And like I said, they have tour mode, and it would be extremely cool to disseminate that amongst people to get them to see the tour, to, you know, to be engaged in that. So yeah, I think there's many different ways to engage people on an educational level. But I think we've seen a lot more success in people learning from games that are geared towards entertainment rather than geared specifically for education.
I have a question related to Dr. Echavarri's discussion. In terms like this, for archaeology students, it's like really challenging because a lot of our work is hands-on. So do you see any potential in developing like educational tools like geared towards archaeology students, such as like, I don't know, a simulation of excavations or lab work, these kind of things?
Yeah, I've really thought about that. I don't have the expertise myself, but I think it'd be really cool to develop meaningful ways of practicing at archaeology for students to bring down the cost of something like a field school, but also to bring down the cost of not inexperienced work, but I'm trying to find a good word for it. At the current model, we're asking students to excavate in real life archaeological sites, and in some ways that can be nerve-wracking, especially for the archaeologists and the communities that they're excavating in, to have people learning how to excavate for the first time within their communities, right, or within your site. And as we all know, you can only excavate once. So having some kind of a way to preload students with that knowledge base could be really cool, I think. And I hope that's answering your question. That's something that people have been thinking about. I don't think we're quite there yet to really match the kind of unique experience you need to start excavating.
Okay, thanks. We have 3 questions here. Okay, there's 3 questions in the Zoom and 1 question from Facebook. I think the first question was a bit personal. What's your favorite video game from Chris Roldan?
I don't actually know. I played one recently. It's called Doom Eternal, and I posted about it on Twitter a little bit. But it's a very violent game. But it, like I've been talking about the empathy engine thing, it's a game that really takes all of the themes, the music, the gameplay interactivity, and puts it towards the single goal of putting its themes forward, its themes of individuality, its themes of anti-institutionalism, and really pushes that. And I thought that was a really cool way to engage those motifs on such a multi-scale level. So at the moment, that's my favorite game. But yeah, I don't have a specific one.
Okay, thanks, Kale. There's another question. I think it's a bit clarification. From Marinella Mina. Am I correct in understanding that video game archaeology is limited to MMOs? MMO.
MMO stands for massively multiplayer online game. Many people will know this as something like World of Warcraft. These are games where thousands of people are playing on the same server at one time. Yes and no. MMOs are at the forefront of persistent game worlds. So something like No Man's Sky is kind of an MMO. And so being able to do archaeology about people interacting in those game worlds, sort of the meta version of it, that is currently mostly limited to MMOs. Death Stranding is not one, and I talked about that, the map one. But you can do a video game archaeology at different scales in different games. So, you know, a game that engages in archaeological, portraying archaeology, that's one way you can use video game archaeology to talk about that. So it's not only limited to MMOs, it's basically any game.
Okay, so there's a question from Zoe. Do you have any experience with virtual reality games for exploration?
No, I want to, but I don't have virtual reality as a headset. The only thing close to that is like Pokemon Go on the iPhone or something, which is pretty cool for. Someone wrote about Pokemon Go as a way to engage in heritage sites a little bit more, but it's not my expertise, no.
Okay, I'm now reading questions from Facebook. So there are 2 questions. One is from Dr. Mike Hernandez. Could you elaborate more on the difference between video games as artifacts and the usual traditional understanding of what an artifact is in traditional archaeology?
Sure, I don't think there really is that much of a difference. Video games, I have one here, are an artifact. They are produced, they're mass produced, but they are produced. And, you know, that's basically that. The only difference, I think, is that to really get at understanding what a video game is, you have to play through it. And that's sort of similar to analyzing a piece of pottery for its decoration or its elemental components, right? It's similar to an iPhone or your laptop. If your laptop was to not work anymore and you could never turn it on again, you wouldn't get the full understanding of what that was for, right? So it's the same thing with games. Unless you're able to play them, you're not getting the full impact of them as an artifact. Hopefully I answered the question.
Okay. There's another question from Odonio. I observed that some video games are so violent like GTA. Do you think playing this kind of game have negative effects in players in their virtual and real world?
I used to be of the opinion that no, but I've come around to that in some ways, yes. It's not anything as studies have shown that it's not something like you play a violent video game and you are ready to go on a rampage. That's not what it's about. It's more about, like I said, when you're playing a violent video game, if it's not framed critically, if it's not framed the right way, you're empathizing with the violence rather than with the misery that you're causing or with the emotions of being violent. So a game that is asking you to empathize with being violent is maybe the wrong way to go about it. And we do see those effects in gamer culture at large. We've seen people, lash out violently on message boards, and I think that comes a little bit from people, both games that are uncritical of their message, but also players not fully engaging with things. So that's what I was talking about a little bit when I was talking about that anthropology and archaeology we're sort of charged with maybe that we need to be studying this more to see what kind of effects those games are having.
Okay, thanks, Gail, for answering that question. There's another question from Professor Well. Awesome lecture. Have you played Detroit Become Human? The game evokes empathy, but they use Android robots. I remember playing Medal of Honor on PS2. History facts were spot on.
Yeah, to the second part, yeah, video games are getting really good at portraying history. And so that's cool. Like I said, I'm a big fan of Assassin's Creed for that. As for Detroit Become Human, no, I haven't. I've heard good things, but I'm limited in my time. But maybe I'll take a second look at it.
Okay. Are there any questions or okay? Okay, from Dr. Acabado. Following up on that, do you think video game archaeology is democratizing access to the past?
That's a complicated question. In some way, it's moving it towards that. But again, we're dealing with an industry that is heavily rooted in capitalism, and there's a pay-to-play aspect to history at this point. So yes, it's democratizing it in that you don't have to be a historian to engage in these histories anymore, especially a virtual one. But there's still that pay-to-play aspect. So I don't know. It's sort of a here and there kind of thing.
Okay. I also have a question. I also work at the museum. So one of our problem at the present because of this COVID-19 was um, because of this COVID-19. Museums are closed, so we can't push through for exhibit. So, do you recommend like doing a virtual exhibit or a virtual curation of a particular and a game, something like that? Is it possible to do it in a museum in museum work?
Um, you're a little choppy, but I think you're asking if I recommend museums to do virtual walkthroughs of the museum.
Yeah,
Is that
something.
where you're? I don't know. I've seen some do it pretty well. Something like Google Maps kind of thing, where you walk through as if you can do it like on Google Maps Street View. I'm not sure. Museums are a whole different beast, and that's more something like my wife's territory. Um, so yeah, I'm not sure. Um, uh, but it's something to think about, especially as I'm hopefully this is a one-time thing, but as we're going forward, I think we should be prepared to engage the public in digital ways, not just because we're being in lockdown, but because that's how people are starting to engage more and more now. I've seen, like, I think it's the Getty is putting some of their artwork inside of Animal Crossing, so you can download the artwork and put it on your virtual walls. So that's one way that people are doing it. I'm not sure about others.
Okay. Are there any questions or insights from our panelists or participants? Okay. Yeah. Personally, I learned a lot this morning. So I hope some of our participants and people who may watch this replay could also learn from it. So if you have any more questions or clarifications, you can send a message to the museum page, or you can write your comments, and will probably Kale can answer it eventually. So um so okay. So I guess this we're okay. Sorry, there's a follow up. Okay, can I consider this as the last question? So
Sure.
okay, from Joshua Villanueva. Generally, there are some direct ways of including information education in games. Can you share thoughts on the unique aspect of interactivity of games compared to other forms of media and its potential?
Yeah, I think the best way to really think about it is people are, go on a trip somewhere, and they often will say you had to be there to really know what I'm talking about, right? So I think that games have that ability to put you in that place rather than just seeing that place. And, right now and maybe never, it's going to be like perfect one-to-one. But I sometimes think of it as instead of reading Shakespeare, you're acting Shakespeare. I think that's a different experience to reading it. And it's the same thing if you are sensing the sense of scale of what you're interacting with, and being able to do things that you can't do in real life. For instance, see what the site looked like in the past, or see information pop up that you wouldn't see in normally. That's a whole different experience than reading about it or seeing pictures, and without the same impacts that maybe tourism might have.
I guess we're good. On behalf of the organizing committee, thank you to our participants and to our panelists, Dr. Acabado, Dr. Peterson, Karime, Zoe, Maddie, uh, Chris, and Professor Atole and Professor Roel. So thank you, Kale, for this lecture, for bridging the past and the present. So cheers, but this
Yeah.
is coffee.
Yeah, thank you for having me. That was a really great exercise. It was really fun. Hopefully,
Salamat.
the intro to the topic.
See you next year.
See you.
Salamat.
Salamat.